September 12, 1945, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The war in Europe had been over for 4 agonizing months, a ceasefire on a continent of ghosts and rubble, but its echoes still reverberated across the globe, rippling through the lives of millions, even here, in the blistering alien heart of Texas. The morning sun beat down on the repatriation center with a relentless, punishing heat that turned the very air thick and shimmering. For the women sitting silently inside the cavernous mess hall, it was a heat utterly foreign, a physical manifestation of their displacement. They were German women, a consignment of the defeated, not hardened soldiers from the front lines, but the female auxiliaries who had oiled the gears of the Third Reich's war machine. Clerks from bustling administrative offices in Berlin, nurses who had staunched wounds in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, fresh-faced radio operators of the Luftwaffenhelferinnen who had relayed orders as Allied bombers turned their cities to ash, captured in the final chaotic collapse of a nation that had promised them a 1,000-year reign. They were now prisoners of war on American soil, waiting in a strange purgatory for the long, uncertain journey home. Before each of them, on a standard-issue U.S. Army tray, sat a plate of food, and on that plate a thick slice of roast beef, its juices pooling next to a scoop of mashed potatoes and a helping of green beans. It was a symbol of American abundance, a meal most civilians back home would consider a Sunday luxury, and it sat untouched. The beef, a testament to the victor's bounty, grew cold, a film of fat congealing on its surface under the slow-turning ceiling fans. American officers watched from the doorways, their initial confusion curdling into a familiar, weary frustration. These women had survived the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden, years of extreme rationing that had turned a single potato into a treasure, and the utter, violent destruction of their entire world. They had seen things the young GIs guarding them couldn't even imagine. Yet here, offered a meal of undeniable substance, they chose hunger. It was a quiet, maddening mutiny. Corporal Frank Zimmermann, a German-American liaison barely out of his teens, moved between the tables. His parents had left Bavaria in the 1920s, and his German, learned at his grandmother's knee, was soft and tinged with a Midwestern accent. He spoke softly to the women, gesturing to the food, his face a mask of earnest concern. Still they would not eat. Their faces were like porcelain, hard and unreadable, and in that moment of stubborn, silent refusal, neither side fully understood the chasm that separated them. They were standing at the crossroads of 2 worlds that had just spent 6 years and tens of millions of lives trying to utterly annihilate each other. Before we continue with this remarkable story, if you're fascinated by these untold moments from history, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep these stories alive. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the globe. Your support helps us bring more forgotten history to light. The refusal seemed simple on the surface, a final, futile act of defiance from a vanquished people. But what happened next in the smoky haze of a Texas afternoon would reveal something profound about the intricate psychology of defeat, the fluid nature of identity, and the strange, unexpected power of food to bridge the impossible. Because when these women finally understood what they were truly being offered, their reaction would tell a story of surrender and acceptance that no formal peace treaty could ever hope to capture. To understand why a simple slice of beef became a battlefield, you must first understand who these women were and the shattered world they had just lost. They were the cogs in a vast, totalitarian machine. Women like Helga Schmidt, a 42-year-old head nurse from Hamburg. Her hands, now resting limply in her lap, had set bones, packed wounds, and closed the eyes of dying boys who looked just like the American guards outside. She was a woman of immense pride and rigid discipline, who saw the world in black and white, order and chaos, strength and weakness. And women like Liesl Vogel, a 21-year-old radio operator from a middle-class Berlin neighborhood, she had been a star pupil, a believer, a member of the League of German Girls who had thrilled to the torchlight parades. Her last official act had been to send a coded transmission confirming the destruction of a nearby anti-aircraft battery. As Soviet shells fell so close, the ground shook and plaster rained from the ceiling. She had been a faithful servant, and her world had rewarded her faith with total ruin. They were not the architects of the war, but they had been its willing participants, steeped from childhood in a potent cocktail of nationalist fervor and sophisticated propaganda. Joseph Goebbels' ministry had painted a vivid picture for them. Germany, a bastion of high culture, discipline and moral purity, standing against a world of degenerate and inferior peoples. America, in this telling, was the ultimate boogeyman, a nation of crude, racially mixed, gum-chewing barbarians, a culture defined by its excess, its wastefulness, and its lack of soul. For years, this worldview had been reinforced by the hard reality of scarcity. The German home front was a world of ersatz everything: coffee made from roasted acorns and chicory, bread bulked up with sawdust and potato peels, sausages containing more filler than meat. The infamous turnip winter was not a distant memory. Its privations were etched into their bodies, in their pallor, in their gaunt frames. A watery stew with a few scraps of potato and cabbage was a good day. Meat was a phantom, a ghost of a memory, from a time before the war. Now, in the humiliation of defeat, they were confronted with unimaginable plenty. The thick, juicy slab of beef on their plates wasn't just food, it was a psychological assault. To their eyes, it represented every accusation their leaders had ever leveled against America. It was wasteful, it was excessive, it was arrogant. It felt less like an offering of sustenance and more like a deliberate flaunting of victory, a taunt served on a china plate. For Helga, who had watched children starve, the sight of it was a physical offense. For Liesl, it was the confirmation of a lie she had been told was truth. It was easier to believe the propaganda than to accept the horrifying possibility that their entire sacrifice had been for nothing. Corporal Zimmermann, caught between his American uniform and his German tongue, felt the full weight of this impasse. He tried to explain the situation to his commanding officer, Colonel Arthur Morrison, a man who saw the world in terms of logistics and objectives. Morrison's office was sparse and functional, a temporary space for a temporary problem. He was a pragmatic, no-nonsense career officer in his early 50s who had spent the war orchestrating the movement of men and materiel across Europe. He understood supply lines, tonnage, and timetables. The subtle, stubborn pride of his prisoners was a variable he couldn't quantify. "They won't eat beef! For God's sake, why not?" he asked, his voice tight with impatience. "Sir, it's complicated," Zimmermann began, struggling to find the words. "It's about what it represents. For the last 5 years, they've been told we're wasteful, undisciplined. To them, a giant slab of meat like that, it's offensive. Some of them think it might be horse meat, something we'd feed to animals, but for most, I think they see it as a symbol of our arrogance. It's a matter of pride. It's the last thing they have left to control." Morrison ran a hand over his tired face. "Pride doesn't fill your stomach, Corporal, and I've got medical reports saying some of them are suffering from malnutrition. We have a duty of care. Fine. What do they eat, Zimmermann?" "The basics are bread, potatoes, root vegetables, soup, maybe some fish or chicken if it's prepared simply." So for the next week, the mess hall adjusted. The roast beef disappeared. In its place came boiled chicken, baked cod, heaps of potatoes and canned beans. The meals were bland, colourless and institutional, but they were acceptable. The women ate. They ate mechanically, without comment or pleasure, but they ate. The silent protest was over, replaced by a sullen, silent compliance. But then the fragile news system faltered. Fort Sam Houston was a massive, humming transit point in the Great Demobilization. Thousands of American GIs were processing through on their way to homes they hadn't seen in years. The base hospital was full, and the vast administrative staff had to be fed. In the complex triage of military logistics in mid-September 1945, securing a consistent supply of fresh fish for a small, politically insignificant group of German female POWs in San Antonio, Texas, was nobody's priority. The requests got lost. The shipments were diverted. The mess sergeant, a burly career soldier from the piney woods of Georgia named William Tucker, approached the colonel, his white apron stained, his hat held respectfully in his hands. He was a man who spoke in problems and solutions. "Sir," he began, his southern drawl thick as molasses, "we're running short on the fish and chicken for the German ladies. Quartermaster says the GIs come first, but I got a warehouse full of beef briskets they sent by mistake. Tough as boot leather, but it's meat." Morrison sighed, the problem returning like a headache. "And we've already established they won't eat it, Sergeant." Tucker shifted his weight, a glint in his eye. "Sir, with all due respect, what if we don't call it beef? What if we make 'em something so different they ain't never seen nothing like it before?" Morrison leaned back in his chair, his curiosity piqued by the sergeant's quiet confidence. "I'm listening. Sir, I ain't from here, but I've been stationed in Texas long enough to learn a thing or two. Down here, they do something to that tough brisket. They transform it. It ain't roasting, it ain't frying. They call it barbecue, and when it's done right, it don't look, smell, or taste nothing like that roast we served 'em." What Sergeant Tucker proposed was not deception, not exactly. It was translation. He was suggesting a form of culinary diplomacy, one rooted in the unique hybrid history of Central Texas itself. He didn't know the full academic history, but he knew the practical results. In the mid-19th century, this region had been settled by a wave of German and Czech immigrants, people fleeing hardship in Europe for the promise of cheap land. They brought with them their traditions of butchery, sausage-making, and smoking meats for preservation. They opened meat markets in dusty little towns that still bear their names, New Braunfels, Fredericksburg, to avoid wasting the tougher, less desirable, and therefore less profitable cuts of beef, like the fatty, muscular brisket. They turned to the old ways. They adapted their European smoking techniques to their new environment, using the native post oak wood that grew in abundance. They learned to smoke the meat low and slow, not for hours, but for half a day or more, until the tough collagen and connective tissues melted into gelatin, rendering the meat impossibly tender, succulent, and utterly transformed. The irony was beautiful, though likely lost on everyone in that office. The solution to feeding these proud, defeated German prisoners might lie in a folk tradition brought to the Texas soil by their own countrymen a century earlier. Colonel Morrison, a pragmatist to his core, saw the elegant logic in the absurdity. "All right, Sergeant," he said, "run a test, but if they don't eat it, the briskets are on you." The next morning, long before the Texas sun had begun its assault, Sergeant Tucker was at work. He arrived at the mess hall at 4 a.m., the world still draped in darkness and silence. He had requisitioned a single, magnificent brisket, a 14-pound slab of beef, its surface a complex geography of muscle, and a thick cap of hard, white fat. In the stark light of the kitchen, he began his ritual. He was no longer just a mess sergeant, he was an artisan. With a deft boning knife, he trimmed the excess hard fat, sculpting the brisket, leaving a perfect quarter-inch cap that would render down and baste the meat during its long slumber in the smoke. He seasoned it, not with a complex array of spices, but with the holy trinity of Central Texas tradition, a liberal coating of coarse kosher salt and coarse ground black pepper, the Dalmatian rub. It was simple, honest, and all that was needed. Behind the mess hall stood a large black offset smoker, a utilitarian steel drum that looked more like a piece of industrial equipment than a culinary instrument. Tucker filled the firebox with seasoned post oak wood that had been cured for almost a year, its scent dry and sweet. He lit the fire, and with the practiced hand of a master, he coaxed it into a small, clean-burning flame. He adjusted the vents, controlling the airflow with minute precision, until a gentle plume of thin, blue-white smoke began to drift from the chimney. This was the good smoke, the secret to barbecue that didn't taste acrid or bitter. He placed the seasoned brisket, fat cap up, onto the grate in the main chamber, as far from the firebox as possible. Then he closed the heavy steel lid, and he settled in for the long wait. For the next 12 hours, Tucker was a sentinel. He tended the fire, adding a split log every hour or so, his senses attuned to the smoker's rhythms. He didn't rely on fancy thermometers, but on the look of the smoke, the smell in the air, the gentle hiss and sizzle from within. He was conducting an orchestra of smoke, heat, and time, coaxing the tough muscle into submission through a slow, patient alchemy. By noon, a smell began to drift across the repatriation center. It was a scent entirely unfamiliar to the base, not the smell of roasting or grilling, but something deeper, richer, more complex. The smell of sweet wood smoke and slowly rendering beef fat, a primal, mouth-watering aroma that spoke of patience and care. GIs walking to their own lunch stopped and sniffed the air. Their heads, turning administrative staff, found excuses to walk past the mess hall, drawn by the invisible, delicious current. At 4 p.m., after 12 hours in the smoke, Tucker deemed it ready. He opened the smoker, and a cloud of fragrant steam billowed out. The brisket was unrecognizable. Its surface was a deep, dark mahogany, almost black, a crusty bark of rendered fat and spices. It was no longer a raw piece of meat, it was an artifact. When he prodded it, the whole thing jiggled like gelatin, a sign of perfectly rendered connective tissue. He wrapped it in butcher paper and placed it in a warmer to rest, allowing the juices that had been driven to the center by the heat to redistribute throughout the meat. This step, he knew, was as crucial as the smoking itself. An hour later, he placed the rested brisket on a large cutting board. The final revelation, with a long, razor-sharp slicing knife, he cut into it, against the grain. Each slice fell away, revealing a cross-section of his day's work. The dark, crusty bark, a beautiful, distinct, pink smoke ring just beneath it, and a center of impossibly tender, juicy beef. He plated it simply the way it was served in the old meat markets of Lockhart and Taylor. A few overlapping slices of brisket on a tray, accompanied by nothing more than slices of plain white bread to sop up the juices, some sharp dill pickles, and raw white onion. This wasn't a fancy meal. It was peasant food elevated to artistry by craft and patience. He found Corporal Zimmerman. "Corporal, go tell 'em dinner is served." Zimmerman looked at the dark, almost alien-looking meat. "What am I supposed to tell them it is, Sergeant?" Tucker wiped his hands on his apron, a faint smile on his lips. "You tell 'em it's Texas barbecue. That's not a lie. That's exactly what it is." That evening, the atmosphere in the mess hall was thick with a familiar suspicion. The women filed in and sat down, their movements weary. Then they saw the plates, their eyes narrowed. The dark, sliced meat on their trays looked nothing like the pale grey roast beef they had so decisively refused before. Its texture was different, streaked with glistening fat. Its color was a deep, smoky brown, edged with a strange pinkish hue, and the smell was entirely new and overwhelming. It was the scent that had been teasing the air all afternoon, now concentrated before them. Wood smoke, char, and a deep, almost sweet savoriness. Corporal Zimmerman approached the table where Helga Schmidt sat with the younger Liesel Vogel and a few other senior women. He carried a plate as if it were a diplomatic pouch. "It is a regional specialty," he explained carefully in German. "A Texas tradition they are very proud of. It is smoked meat. They call it barbecue." Helga Schmidt, the proud nurse, the group's informal, unassailable leader, was the gatekeeper. Her gaze was a physical force. If she refused, they all would. She studied the plate with the intensity of a surgeon examining a wound. She picked up a small piece with her fork, holding it up to the light, turning it over, examining it from all angles. It fell apart under the pressure of the tines. Finally, with a sigh of what seemed like weary resignation, she slowly put the small morsel in her mouth. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The other women watched her face, searching for a sign. They had learned to read each other's subtle expressions over years of shared hardship. Helga's stony expression flickered. A furrow appeared between her brows. It was not disgust. It was surprise, consideration. Her jaw worked slowly, thoughtfully. Then, a barely perceptible nod. She took another, larger bite. A quiet, hesitant voice broke the silence. "Es ist gut," she murmured, almost to herself. "It is. Good." It was more than good. The tough, stringy, boiled-tasting beef she had expected was gone, replaced by something that melted on the tongue, a complex symphony of smoke, spice, and profound beefiness. It was unlike any meat she had ever tasted. One by one, as if a spell had been broken, the other women followed her lead, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, a quiet murmur of appreciation, a sound not heard in that mess hall before, began to fill the room. The clinking of forks against plates became steady, purposeful. The distinction was everything. In their minds, they were not abandoning their principles or surrendering their pride. They were encountering something entirely new, a food that existed outside their known categories. This was not the conqueror's bland boiled beef. This was Texas barbecue, a thing with its own name, its own identity. The transformation from raw ingredient to finished product was so complete, so alchemical, that it had become something else entirely. And that made it permissible. It was a loophole of the soul. Over the next few weeks, a quiet revolution took place. Sergeant Tucker smoked brisket every other day. The women ate. They began to look forward to it. The dark circles under their eyes began to fade, replaced by a healthier color. The tension in the mess hall eased, replaced by a quiet, shared ritual. Colonel Morrison, reviewing the medical reports and the now empty supply requests for fish, noted simply in his official log that the dietary situation had been resolved through culturally appropriate food preparation. But something else was happening, something the reports couldn't capture. The act of eating barbecue became a bridge. It was the first crack in the wall of silence and suspicion. It opened a conversation that formal procedures and military commands never could. The women, led by the endlessly curious Liesel Vogel, began asking questions. Through Corporal Zimmerman, they began to unravel the mystery of this strange and wonderful food. One afternoon, Sergeant Tucker, with Zimmerman translating, took a small group of them, including Helga and Liesel, out to see the smoker, which he now referred to as his office. He stood by the big black steel drum, explaining the process with the simple, direct passion of a true believer. He showed them the post oak logs, explaining why he preferred them over the more common mesquite. "Mesquite's fine for grilling," he said, as Zimmerman translated. "But for a long smoke, it's too strong, burns hot and fast. Post oak is gentle, it respects the meat." He talked about the importance of a low, steady temperature, showing them how he controlled it by minutely adjusting the vents. He spoke of the patience required 12 hours minimum, he repeated. Sometimes 16, you can't rush it. You just gotta let it tell you when it's ready. The women listened with a focused, serious attention. They came from a culture of engineers, artisans, and farmers. They were not strangers to craft, to the patient application of skill over time. They knew what it meant to work with time and temperature, whether in a kiln, a workshop, or a field, to coax transformation from raw materials. They saw in Tucker not a jailer, but a fellow craftsman. Then Liesel asked the crucial question, "Is the meat expensive? Is this a luxury for rich people?" Tucker let out a short laugh. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners, "brisket used to be the cheapest cut you could buy. Garbage meat. Folks didn't want it. Too tough, too fatty. They'd grind it up for hamburger. Then some fellas, German butchers actually, down in the hill country, They figured out if you just give it enough time and smoke, it turns into something special. But no, it's always been working-class food. Food for regular folks. This piece of information landed with the force of a revelation. This wasn't the food of arrogant conquerors, a luxury flaunted in their faces. This was humble food. It was the food of immigrants, of working people who took something undesirable, something others had thrown away, and through skill, ingenuity, and patience, made it extraordinary. This was a value they understood deep in their bones, a value they could respect. There was a democracy in that brisket, a kind of honor that transcended victor and vanquished. Then came the most astonishing connection of all. Zimmerman, prompted by Tucker's mention of German butchers, began to elaborate. He explained the history he knew, how the barbecue tradition they were enjoying was started by German and Czech immigrants, just like their own grandparents and great-grandparents. He told them about the meat markets in towns like Lockhart and Luling and Taylor. They were, in a way, tasting a distant, sun-scorched echo of their own culture, transformed by the Texas landscape and a different branch of history. They weren't just eating American food, they were eating German-American food. For the first time, the rigid, black-and-white line between us and them began to soften, to blur into a smoky, indistinct grey. By late September, the situation had settled into a comfortable, almost surreal routine. Then one evening, after the meal was cleared, Helga Schmidt made a request. She asked to speak with Corporal Zimmerman alone. They stood in the warm evening air just outside the mess hall, the chirping of crickets filling the silence. She wasn't angry. Her expression was knowing, her posture relaxed, tinged with a dry, world-weary irony. "Corporal Zimmerman," she began in German, her voice low. "This Texas barbecue, it is made from a cow, is it not? It is beef." It was a statement, not a question. Zimmerman felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He had been a party to this gentle deception. He braced for the accusation, the anger. He hesitated for a moment, then decided on the simple truth. "Yes, Frau Schmidt, it's beef." Helga looked at her hands, then back at Zimmerman. A small, wry smile, the first he had ever seen on her face, played on her lips. "We knew," she said softly. "Perhaps not the first time. The smoke and the spices, it was so different, but by the second time, we knew. Beef is beef. The body does not lie." Zimmerman was stunned. "Then why did you eat it? Why did you let the others eat it?" Helga took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon. "The first beef you served us," she said, her voice gaining strength, "that was war beef. It was the meat of a conqueror, boiled and slapped on a plate without thought, without care. It was a symbol of your power and our humiliation. It was an insult. This," she gestured vaguely towards the empty mess hall, This is different. This is peace beef." "Peace beef?" Zimmerman repeated the strange phrase. "Yes," Helga affirmed. "The man who makes it, the sergeant, he does not cook with arrogance. He cooks with care, with patience. We watched him. He tends the fire for hours. He respects the process. He gives the food his time, his skill. He is not flaunting his victory. He is sharing his craft. To eat that first beef would have been to accept our defeat. To eat this barbecue, it is to accept an offering of skill and respect. It is an act of peace." The distinction she drew wasn't culinary, it was existential. The roast beef was an act of raw power. The barbecue was an act of refined craft. One was an imposition, the other was an invitation. To eat the barbecue was not to surrender one's pride, it was to participate in a ritual of transformation that acknowledged their humanity and the humanity of their captors. They had not been defeated by the barbecue, they had been invited to share in it. This subtle shift was a profound, unspoken lesson in the psychology of occupation. It demonstrated that American power was not purely military or industrial, it was also cultural, adaptable, and, in the hands of a gruff sergeant from Georgia, surprisingly human. The ability to turn the toughest, most undesirable cut of meat into something sublime was, in its own small way, a demonstration of the same pragmatic, problem-solving spirit that had built the Liberty ships and coordinated the Normandy landings. It was power of a different kind, the power to create, to transform, to share. In early October, the official orders finally came through. Colonel Morrison learned the women would be departing for the port of Bremerhaven in 2 weeks. He called in Sergeant Tucker and Corporal Zimmerman. "I want to do something for them before they leave," Morrison said, his tone uncharacteristically warm. "Something appropriate." The answer was immediate and obvious to all three men. On October 10th, 1945, Fort Sam Houston hosted one of the most unusual barbecues in Texas history. As the fierce afternoon sun mellowed into a golden evening, long tables covered in checkered cloths were set up in a grassy area behind the mess hall. Sergeant Tucker and several other cooks he had recruited presided over a battery of smokers, their fragrant smoke perfuming the air. They had cooked 3 full briskets, 2 massive pork shoulders for pulled pork, dozens of chickens, and long ropes of smoked sausage. The German women emerged from their barracks, hesitant at first, and found a scene of bizarre festivity. This time, the American staff, the officers, the guards, the nurses from the base hospital, were not observing them. They were in line with them. For the first time, they ate together, not as victors and vanquished, not as captors and prisoners, but simply as people sharing a meal under the vast, benevolent Texas sky. As the evening wound down, Helga Schmidt stood up. With Corporal Zimmerman at her side to translate, she addressed the assembled group. Her voice was clear and steady. "We do not know what awaits us in Germany," she began, her words carried by Zimmerman across the quiet crowd. "We are told our homes are gone, our nation is divided, but we will not forget what happened here. In this place you did not treat us only as enemies, you treated us as people. You showed us care, and you shared with us your craft. We thank you." Sergeant Tucker, a man of few words, stood by his pit, his face illuminated by the glow from the firebox. He simply wiped his hands on his apron and gave a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement. It was all that needed to be said. A week later, the women departed. They walked up the gangplank of a transport ship, carrying few possessions, but they took with them the memory of smoke, of patience, and of a shared meal that had, for a brief, strange time, turned a Texas repatriation camp into a place of unexpected, unwritten peace. They returned to a broken country, a nation grappling with immense guilt, unimaginable loss, and the monumental task of rebuilding from absolute zero. Their individual fates are now lost to the quiet drift of history. We don't know if Liesl, in her new life in the rubble, ever tried to replicate the barbecue, or if Helga ever spoke again of the peace beef she ate in Texas. But the story remains a small, stubborn testament to the quiet, often overlooked moments where history actually turns, not in the grand halls of power, but in the shared spaces of human interaction. It's a story about men like Colonel Morrison, who chose pragmatism over protocol, Corporal Zimmerman, who bridged 2 worlds with his empathy and his words, and Sergeant William Tucker, who understood a profound truth, that sometimes the most powerful diplomacy doesn't come from the ink of a pen, but from the gentle, transformative embrace of smoke. In the end, peace didn't begin at a treaty table in Potsdam or Nuremberg. For a small group of defeated women in the heart of an enemy nation, it began with the taste of salt, pepper, and slow-rendered fat. It began with the simple, profound, and surprising humanity of Texas barbecue. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it. And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from our shared past. Until next time.